Thank you, Lucy. We appreciate y'all that you've done in getting this set up today, and thank you to all of you who are here joining us today on this webinar. Our focus today is going to be on close reading, and we're looking at it not just from the standpoint of having close reading skills and how important that is for students in a lot of different content areas, but we're also going to look at it from a standpoint of what a difference that can make as our students begin to do those extended responses and short answers. So during this session, we're going to look at some strategies to help enhance students' close reading skills. We're going to talk about how important close reading really is, and we're going to take a look at some specific strategies that you can use in order to work with that as you're working with students to learn more about constructed response. We're also going to share with you some resources and ideas as we go through today. The other thing that we will be doing is that Bonnie and I will be answering different questions as we go through. You can feel free to chat out your question, and as the time goes through, we'll have a time set aside to answer those questions. If some of them pertain directly to something we're on right then, we'll try to answer that as well as we can. But we want to start with the idea that there's similar skills across this test. It's just different content areas. And that's important to know because in adult education we have limited amount of time to work with most of our students. And so how do we make sure that we're taking advantage of that time? So let's talk for just a minute about what it is that students need to know and what do they need to be able to do across those different content areas. Well, first and foremost, students have to be able to read closely. And that means that no longer can we look at this quick skim or scan through a document, but rather to closely read and be able to extract information. And as we go forward, that's going to have a big impact on the student's ability to write effectively when they get to those extended responses. Students also have to do something else. They've got to analyze what they've read. They've got to be able to take that text apart and then from that be able to make inferences or valid claims. And then here comes the direct connection into that writing. They've got to evaluate evidence that they have extracted from that text so that then they can respond effectively to those short answer as well as those extended response. You're going to notice in here we had two major words that are very important, analyze and evaluate. And as we go forward, we're going to talk a little bit more about the importance because that does make a difference if we want our students to earn those points when they get into the extended response and short answer. So, Bonnie, how about if you could talk to us for a few minutes about some of the challenges that we're seeing right now for students as they're working in the area of reasoning through language arts.
I sure will, and I think as we look at some of these challenges, all of us see that it's more than just through reasoning and language arts. These are some of the same challenges we see in the other parts of the test. And we know that students have a lot of difficulty in understanding those specific details and main ideas, or sometimes we call them the central idea, in the written sources. And part of the reason for this is that many of our students have very ineffective reading skills. And because they're facing much more complex text on the GED test, that causes problems. Students also have a problem in determining which of those details are going to support the main idea, and understanding that not all details are major supporting details. Not all details are really essential to understanding the passage. Sometimes there's details in text which are just nice to know or minor, but there again really do not give the reader the true understanding of the main idea that he or she needs. And when we look at this particular challenge, that's going to be important not just in a constructed response, but also in some of the other technology-enhanced items as students need to do close reading. Another area that's causing challenges for our students is difficulty in identifying a theme or some element that supports a theme. We all know that in literary passages especially, students need to be able to uncover a universal truth that's there. And oftentimes that's not exactly stated, but instead students need to infer. Themes such as overcoming adversity, or the theme of love or friendship, maybe even the theme of man against nature or man against man, or how sometimes we need to sacrifice to get rewards. Bottom line is those are themes, and themes need to be inferred from what students read. Another area, and this is again important to our students to understand both for the writing samples as well as the technology enhanced items, and that's the ability to be able to analyze relationships within written sources, such as causes and effect, purpose and perspective. Can our students identify an author's claim and the reasons that the author has made such a claim? And then I really like that fourth one, because is the evidence that a student is gleaning from his or her reading, is it sufficient, and is it accurate? Or, as they're looking at it, is there an error in the reasoning? Are there logical fallacies? Again, all challenges that our students are having within reasoning through language arts, and very similarly in such areas as science and social studies. But all of these areas seem to deal with the fact that our students need to build more effective, close reading skills of complex text. And when we look at different words that oftentimes are used when we read about how do we teach students close reading, they're the words in this Wordle here. Do our students know how to analyze? Do they know text well and recognize things? Do they persist when they read? How many of our students note take or come up with ideas? These are just a few of the words of close reading. So if those are a few of the words of close reading, then what exactly is close reading, Susan?
Well, I think, for many of us, we're used to this thing of, being able to fairly give a little cursory read of something, real quick reading rather than diving into things. It's kind of become the way that we look at things as we, read text and we read things from the internet and emails and all those types of things. But when we really talk about close reading, that's something that's very methodical, and it's about really taking whatever that text is and breaking it down into a lot of different parts. Because what our students have to do is, and I like that second bullet, where they have to unpack the text meaning, which means that they've got to look at a deeper level as they're going through. They've got to look at the sentences and how those ideas and events are developed as they move through. They've got to take evidence out of that text. And they have to be able to make those inferences based on what they've read. Not everything they're going to encounter on the test or in real life is going to be something that's just right there for them to just pull it out like magic. Rather, they're going to have to think about what they've read and what that truly means. When we talk about this, what we find is that depth of close reading really matters. It's one of those things where, as we're going through, you have to pay close attention to how the text unfolds. And how do you do that if you're working in the classroom and you want students to learn those close reading skills? Well, you have to ask them questions that depend on the text. Text-dependent questions. Those are the things that require them to reach in and pull out information, not from their background knowledge, but from what the text is telling them. It's also about how we help students build knowledge. If we construct those questions correctly, students are learning and they're accessing more and new information. What it will let them do as we go through is that this is going to help prepare students for any kind of reading task that they can encounter after graduation. Students are not, this is earning a high school diploma is not an end point, it's a beginning. And so as students want to move on into higher education or technical training or into the workplace, all of those different things are going to require that they read at different points. And the thing that I find from Dr. Douglas Fisher, who is a true expert on close reading, he's out of San Diego State University, is the fact that even though it's called close reading, it has a lot to do with writing as well. So those are all important elements that we have to keep in mind as we go through. Of course, you know, and this one harkens back to Bonnie, who is a big Stephen King fan, is that if you don't have the time to read, you don't have the time or the tools to write. It's simple as that. And I think that's what's missing with many of our students who are out there. So, Bonnie, there's one thing that really plays a big part in that close reading, and that's patterns of organization. So could you talk a little bit about that and why it's important that students be able to recognize these?
You know, Susan, this is one of the areas, if we spend just a little bit of time in different types of text and talk to our students about what are the signal words that work with these types of text, our students would be much better in nonfiction understanding. And we know that nonfiction is set up with different types of organizational structures. Sometimes it's a passage that describes something. Sometimes it gives us a sequence and order, or of course we all know compare, contrast, and cause and effect. But oftentimes if I'm reading, let's say a social studies item, and I'm reading about something in history that happened, I need to know that there are words that tell me this is the cause and this is the effect, understanding that oftentimes there are multiple causes and multiple effects. And sometimes I need to determine what is the most significant cause or the most significant effect. It is really about close reading. And then I think about science and all of the different things that one will read about with problems and solutions. Not only would I need to know that for my short answers, but there again, many of the other question types would ask me to put on my thinking cap and say, okay, I now know the problem, what would be the most effective solution? And like I said, sometimes just students understanding the signal words in a problem and solution, if it talks about an issue or if it says therefore or as a result, then I can more easily find that information. And if you're wondering where is some of that, we will tell you a little bit later on that you've got a full page in your guide that will provide you with some of those signal words that you can share with your students. Because research does support that effective readers do use text structure. They use it to predict what is to be read as well as to better comprehend what that text says. We know that effective readers use text structure to not only look at how the author has written it or organized it, but those key words. And of course, it also helps us as we're looking at headings and the graphics of reading, all things that are important to create a more effective reader. But as Susan said earlier, analyze and evaluate. We see those words in the prompts for the extended response that students need to analyze or evaluate. But it starts with the reading process. As students go through and read, can they use the skills of analyzation? Can they use the skills of evaluation? In analyzation, can they look at the form and the content and the organization? Can they dig down further and really look closely at what that author's purpose is, or what's his perspective on the topic? Can they look whether that evidence supports the claim and the reasons, and is it sufficient? And can they look at logical fallacies? To me, this sounds very similar to a few slides ago when we talked about some of the challenges that students are showing on the current test. It is about analyzation. But it's also about evaluating. Look at the pieces and see, does it work? How is that main claim expressed? Is the information going to support it? Is the data or the evidence reliable? the types of things that you and I do in our daily lives when we're looking at something, let's say to purchase. We evaluate the quality of it, and students need to do the same type of things when they're evaluating text. Susan found the next quote, and again, it's from Dr. Douglas Fisher, but it really says it all, because what is close reading? It's a careful and purposeful rereading of a text. And as we talk about close reading in just a moment, we want to let you know that it's not about everything we read, but it's about specific texts that we read. So, Susan.
In fact, as we're going through, it's about making sure that we're finding texts that are worthy of that close inspection, that close reading as we move through. We talk about that it's text worth reading and it's questions worth asking and answering. So we have to go through and really dive down into what is close reading and what are the steps that we can take. So what we're going to do over the next few slides is we're actually going to talk a little bit about, okay, how can I attack this thing in the classroom called close reading? How can I get my students started with the process itself? Well, first and foremost, you have to find the right text. And we're going to talk a little bit after this slide about how you go about doing some of that and how you can kind of get that in your mind, because we have to start looking at making sure our students are reading complex, content-rich text. Bottom line, we have to be able to use those texts for multiple purposes. Because as we said earlier in this webinar itself, you don't have long periods of time in order to be able to work with your students. I wish that you did. All of us do. But many of our students are there for a limited amount of time, so we've got to make every single minute count. So any text that we can use that's content-rich will allow us to help students build that knowledge that we want them to build. The other thing I want you to pay attention to on this, too, is we're talking about short passages. You're not going to do close reading with a passage that goes on for 4 or 5 pages. This is something where you basically have pretty rich, dense text, and students are going to learn from that. So once you've found that text, it's time for you to do your pre-work. And this is something that as you work through, you'll find that over time it takes less time to work with this, but it is an essential piece, because you're going to have to identify what are those things from that text that you really want students to learn. They're going to be key elements or concepts that you want them to understand. And from that, you're going to create a series of TDQs. I love it. We always have to have some kind of acronym or abbreviation. But anyway, text-dependent questions. Not just the who, what, when, where, why, but things that make them dive into that text. You're going to look at keywords that are included there as well. Not so you can give students a list and they can find definitions, but rather that those keywords support whatever the concepts that you're trying to get them to learn will be. They'll find the keywords as they're reading. You just need to make sure that you're able to check those things off as you're moving through. Now, earlier, Dr. Fisher talked about the fact that there was writing involved, and one of the things that you need to look at in close reading is having some way that students can annotate text. Now, we know on the GED test itself, students can highlight those passages, and so what we're trying to do is give them a tool that they can use when they go on in to take the test itself. The next thing is that you may need to, based on your student's level of ability at that point, chunk the text. In other words, maybe the paragraphs are a little bit longer than what your students can handle, so maybe you need to break them into parts. Maybe not. It may work to go through and just use individual paragraphs. And then last but not least is that you need to think about what you want as a reflection activity. And that should be something where students are writing, something that they can do. So Bonnie, can you talk just a few minutes about how to find the right text?
Sure. You know, there are a lot of resources for us in the field about text, which is complex. And one of the easiest things to at least get your brain started with what is complex text is to go ahead and take a look at the coursestandards.org website. They have, and although you're going to see that it does say K through 12, but they have a great resource that gives you an idea of what does complex text look at grade levels 6 to 8, which of course would be our ABE Adult Basic Ed level, and what does it look like as you move to more complex text. Again, a great resource knowing that the types of text that students will encounter on the GED test are texts which are appropriate for students in a high school level. So they could be a multitude of levels. But as you're looking at text, make sure that it's more than just someone saying, oh, this is high school level text, or this is text at a certain level. Take a look at the complexity, and there are a number of different measures that we need to use. One is what they call a qualitative measure of text complexity. And what that does is looks at not only what does the language do, is it highly figurative or is it very literal? Is the language contemporary? It was written in today's language, or like some of the social studies texts, they were written back many hundreds of years ago, and so the text is much more formal, and of course some of our students would say old-fashioned rather than archaic. Is the text literary, more conversational, versus nonfiction, which is a little more academic and sound? And of course, what are the knowledge demands? These are all qualitative measures. Do your students need to understand that there's multiple themes or just one theme? Is it just everyday knowledge that they need to know, or do they need to have that little bit of background knowledge about some big ideas? You know, are the references internal or are they external? So as you're looking at materials, think to yourself, what's the language like and what are the knowledge demands? Those are qualitative measures. But there's also something that we're much more comfortable with, and that is called quantitative measures. That's when we look at a text and we say, oh, it's got a certain lexile or it has a certain grade equivalency. That's the number system of text complexity. And many of them our materials will say it's written at a lexile or a grade equivalent of a such and such level. So we've got qualitative and we have quantitative, but there's one more, and that is what do students need to be able to do with it, and that's professional judgment. Are they having to read it and respond to it? Are they having to respond to it in a constructed response manner? Or is it something that we're going to be able to, quote, lead them through so that there again we'll set up the information? So 3 different measures of text complexity. It's not just about a lexile or a grade equivalent.
Now, Bonnie, one thing that we did add in here is just as a quick reference, and this one is not in the packet that all of you have, those who are participating today, but we just wanted to pull in just 2 little short pieces. One is actually a speech, and as Bonnie said, it's what's the language like? When we look at that from a qualitative standpoint, is the language much more formal, or is it maybe kind of archaic language as we're going through, but is it harder for a student to understand because of the way in which it's written? And this one is just a speech from Patrick Henry to the Second Virginia Convention. As Bonnie would say, one of those things written hundreds of years ago. And then we have something a little bit more contemporary, but again, technical in nature because of the content that's being covered. And this particular one is the biography of an atom. Again, we really need to, and I think this is something that is very important for all of us to keep in mind as adult educators, is we really have to be cognizant of the complexity of text. And are we pushing enough so that our students are having that opportunity for productive struggle? So just 2 short pieces, and again, this is from the same resource that Bonnie just referenced a few minutes ago.
You know, the next step, and I think this is one of those things that as we are getting students ready not only for this test, but for post-secondary ed and real-world experiences, most of those situations don't require that we always give our opinion or what we think about something, but rather, as we're looking forward, what is the text telling us? What kinds of information can we glean? And these are first steps not only for comprehensive or more complex reading, but also as we get closer to saying to our students we want them to write well. And so it's very easy to write a text-dependent question, but it's important that we do so. If students are reading text worth reading, we need to ask questions worth answering. And so as we look at what we call text-dependent questions, the most important thing to think to yourself as you're writing them is, do my students have to read what I've assigned, or can they answer the question without reading it? So rigorous text-dependent questions should not be low-level or just simply recall questions where there happened to be a word in the script or the text and I can just pull it there. They shouldn't all be right there questions because oftentimes the answer is not the second phrase in paragraph 2. The other thing is a text-dependent question needs to focus on comprehension strategies, so there again our students have to closely read. And they shouldn't just be questions. They shouldn't be questions that don't require students to reach further for meaning. So the other thing to know is that text-dependent questions do not rely on personal opinion, background information, or what we term imaginative speculation, but rather on, again, what is in the text that is either there or that they can infer.
So as we're looking at these text-dependent questions, remember, as Bonnie said, we've got to come back to the source itself. What is the source that they're having to follow and read from? We've got to make sure that students are doing more than just recall, and we've got to make sure that students can identify key ideas. Those questions need to be at a higher order. So as they're working through their thinking at a different level, we want them to have that productive struggle where they're having to draw conclusions and engage in arguments and make those inferences as they're moving through. So keep those things in mind. Now, a few minutes ago, we made a comment about how important it is to figure out, okay, what are going to be your annotation tools for students to use so they get used to the process? Well, one way you go about that is to teach students to read with a pencil. Now, I know the test is actually on a computer. What are we doing here with a pencil? Well, in many of our classrooms, this is where we need to start because students are going to be working with different copies of materials, and maybe it won't always be on a computer. But let's give them some tools and strategies that they can use as they move forward. So, simple things. Numbering the paragraphs can be one. Underlining major points or highlighting or circling key words and terms. These are all things that you want students to do. And then we've got a couple symbols because as students are going through, there may be something that's confusing or something that they just don't understand. So they put a question mark there, but they go a little bit beyond that and they actually write down what is their question. And it doesn't have to be a complete sentence by any means, but what is the concern that they have? Maybe as they're going through reading, they found something in that passage that was surprising. Oh, I didn't know that. Oh, well, there's an exclamation point. It explains why. You want to know, why was that surprising? What was different about it? And you see we have that capital E there for example or evidence. Evidence, evidence, evidence. We keep coming back to that. Something that supports the major points. And we want our students to write a note as they're going through about that particular item. And in just a minute, we're going to show you what that looks like in a sample document. Next, as we're going through, there are two more steps. And the fourth step really is about having discussion. And it's not just about giving students a set of questions and saying, okay, write out your answers, but rather talking about them and discussing. That's what we want our students to do. We want them to engage with each other and with us as they're responding to those questions. So we also want students to be able to say to us, okay, this is the answer to this question, and this is where I found it. Again, that shows us that the student is actually doing that close reading and extracting information. But we want to take it a step further, and we want the student to be able to provide the evidence that supports their answer. Again, notice how we're having students dig deeper and think at a higher level for this part of the process. And then last but certainly not least, in fact it's an essential point as we move through, is we want students to write about what they read. You can give them a prompt so that they can find evidence to support a specific claim. You need to make sure that whatever they write, it's not just opinion, but it's about using evidence from the text itself. So those are 5 simple steps as you're going through that, if you start these in the classroom, can make a big difference across the board. Now, one thing that Bonnie and I will add to this is the fact that this is not something that you just do for your students who are preparing for the GED test. You're going to do this with students at even lower levels. Their product may be a little different. Their text will certainly be at a different lexile, but they can begin to learn this process early on. And think of the advantage that gives students as they're working and getting ready for eventually for the GED test itself. So we're going to talk a little bit about putting that process to work. And you can see on the slide here we have a picture of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up our other workbook here. And you may have seen the note from the GED testing service that if you're having trouble seeing the entire page, just use that plus or minus in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, right up above where the actual document is itself. But this is resources for you to use in the classroom. And as I move through, you can see we started with nonfiction text structures, and as Bonnie had mentioned earlier, you'll find the material there with the signal words and some graphic organizers that go along with that. There's also 5 simple strategies on how to read complex text. And that is from 5 close reading strategies to support the Common Core. So take an opportunity to look at that, and it may be something that you want to share with your students. But now we come back to a short passage with multiple purposes that we can use to work with students in the classroom to help them build knowledge. And this is the first inaugural address from Franklin Roosevelt back in March 4th of 1933. And you'll notice it's not a great length. It's merely an excerpt as we go through. But let's take a look at how we break this apart to help students with close reading. The first thing that I would do working with students is I would start to chunk the text. And in this particular case, I decided that it was one of those things after Bonnie and I talked that maybe that first paragraph was just a little too much for the students. And so as a result of that, I broke that into 2 pieces. And this way students can take each section, each chunk separately, and we can work with it. I've also broken down the paragraph 4 into 2 chunks. Same thing, wanted to make sure that I'm giving students the ability to hone in on specific information. And of course, numbered the paragraphs. Now, again, if the student were writing in this, you'd see lots of writing off to the sides, but in our case, Bonnie and I had to put in little text boxes as we go through. But notice what we did. We went through and we underlined major points. So we took that document and started working through it piece by piece. From there, we highlighted words or phrases that weren't understood, or maybe for the students, as these would be those areas where they would have concerns as they're going through. And notice we have those three different things: questions, what was a surprise, and then what's evidence or examples as we're moving through. Now, one thing we'll say about this is that as Bonnie and I were working together to identify text worth reading, this particular one, if you took the date off and kind of a little bit ignored the kind of the sentence structure within it, what you would find is that many of the things referenced in this particular inaugural address relate to things that have been happening in 2008 and 9. So students can begin to see a connection as they move through. And that's really important for our students to do as they're trying to understand. In this case, we're using a social studies passage itself, but they're beginning to learn some of those bigger concepts moving through. Now, what we can do at this particular point in time, we actually could take that same skill, same strategy we just used, and we could move that over to close reading with something that all of us are familiar with at this point in time, and that is the pros and cons, the benefits and arguments against daylight savings time. And this way you can actually see how the process would work with a GED item. What we would want students to be able to do is notice that we're asking them to look for the evidence and underline that evidence supporting the pro side, and then go through and put bold or highlight the evidence supporting the con side of the argument. Same strategy, we're just using it with a different type of text as we're moving through. And taking it one step further, again, we can go back and ask text-dependent questions. The process will work at many different levels. What Bonnie and I have found as we've been working along is that our students are just lacking those strategies as they move through. So let's go back over to our PowerPoint, and since we looked at these earlier in the workbook, we'll move over to, and Bonnie, can you talk a little bit about effective readers?
Definitely. And you know, while you were going through some of that, I thought to myself, one of the areas that our students are having such difficulty in all of the constructed responses is to be able to analyze and evaluate the information. And there's no way for them to do that if they haven't first identified the evidence for both sides of an argument. How can you evaluate or analyze which side is better supported and why if you've not done that? If you wonder where or when we are going to get to the writing, it is first about the reading. And if we can get our students to become more effective readers, then the writing will follow. But without effective reading strategies, the writing is going to continue to be not as good as we'd like to see. So as we look at what our effective readers can do, first of all, know that it's hard work to teach close reading. We don't help students become more effective readers unless we work with them one step at a time and with research-based strategies. So we do know that our effective readers, they can locate that key information or evidence. When you give them a text, can they actually identify a claim, and can they identify the evidence that supports that claim? The other thing we know effective readers can do is they modify their reading based upon the complexity or the difficulty of the text. There again, they may not be doing a close reading on everything they read. In fact, I'm going to tell you they will not. Most of us, when we read the daily newspaper or read a novel, we may not be using our, quote, best close reading skills. However, If we're reading a manual on how to do something, we're probably not only going to read it once, but reread it a couple times in order to do something. We also know that effective readers ask questions. They ask themselves questions before they start reading, such as, what do I think I'm going to learn? Or here's a question I need to find the answer. Do I think it's going to be there? Effective readers also ask questions while they're reading. They may read something and say, what did that really say? Or is this the kind of answer that I would give this particular person or this particular text? And then, of course, effective readers also ask questions after they've read to ensure their comprehension. Effective readers, we also know, can monitor their comprehension. So as they're reading through, not only are they consistently evaluating what they're reading, all of that new information, but they can connect it with existing ideas. And they can organize it in ways that really do make sense to them in what they're reading. All of these things happen, and especially when we do text-dependent questions, our students can use these kinds of things to really, really make it work. So, as we look forward, it is putting two things together because effective argumentative writers do some similar things. If I am good at argumentative writing, I am going to be able to locate that key information or evidence. I'm also going to be able to distinguish between main ideas and supporting details in the text that I've read. And as I'm writing, I'm going to continually ask myself questions. And of course, as I'm writing and becoming an effective writer, I'm also going to monitor my comprehension of the text, bringing in new information and connecting information, more about connecting ideas at the next webinar. And I need to be able to organize information in something that makes sense. So reading and writing really are connected throughout the process because I can't be an effective writer if I'm not an effective reader. And so I do need to make sure that my students are able to read different types of complex text, that they're able to identify text structure, and that they can find those key words and phrases as they read. They need to be able to unpack the prompt and, in writing, be able to develop that claim or argument based upon the evidence. And they have to be able to analyze and evaluate what they've done so that that evidence supports the claim that they're making. And finally, they have to be able to explain how that evidence is connected. And as Susan and I have looked at the different writing samples from GED Testing Service, that's one area we need to work with students more, that connection piece. Not enough to just set a claim, support it with evidence, but can students connect that evidence back to the claim using additional information from their analysis or evaluation? So having said that, Susan, I feel we have a few questions before we finish today, and we also have some folks from GED Testing Service with us. So as we read through these questions, we can get some different types of answers as we go through. So, Susan, let's go ahead and answer some of the questions before we look at some of the additional reading resources that we have.
Okay, and one of the first questions that we had, and this was as we first started, was really that concern about the fact that basically people are using the information they've received from GED Testing Service. They're following the format, but students are still getting few, if any, points on the essay. Could you provide some good information on what you're looking for in regard to the extended responses? And I think there's just a couple things that that we would say to that particular one is the fact that our students is coming back to that analysis and evaluation. Our students are having difficulty in responding to the prompt because they're doing a couple of different things. In many cases, what they're doing is not analyzing and evaluating. They're actually summarizing the text that they have, the source text itself. The other thing that they're not doing is that they're not actually writing enough original text. Many of us have been very concerned about the fact that despite all the work that we do in helping students learn grammar rules and sentence structure and the conventions, our students, in their writing, they're not even earning points in that particular area. And the reason for that is that much of what we see in many of the writing passages is that students are not writing enough what we call original text. In other words, they're listing, in some cases, entire sentences or phrases to such an extent that there really isn't any writing to be analyzed that is their own writing. Rather, it's just spouting back out what the student has done. But I think beyond that, we have to look at it from a standpoint of how students are not, they may make a claim, they may include some evidence, but they're not, as Bonnie said earlier, showing how that evidence connects to that claim. And having said that, I will ask if someone else from GEDTS would like to respond to that, Marty or Daphne, anyone?
Hi, Susan. This is Marty. I think you've hit the main points. I don't really have anything additional to add. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Marty. The main thing that we want to make sure is that people know that our next webinar that's coming up in June will actually be focusing on the very specifics within extended response and short answers. So we want to make sure that you're with us for that particular one as we go in and we dive a little bit deeper into these different areas and that we use some of the resources that we have. In the meantime, I would recommend that you go out to the GED Testing Service website and that you take a look, and I believe on our resources here, under the test resources, that you can find some of the scoring guides and you can find the examples that are included there. So go and take a look at those because that can be very helpful as we work through the process. Bonnie, anything else you want to add to that particular one?
Susan, I think one of or two things actually. Number one is as we look for more resources to use in writing as well as in reading in the classroom, there are so many websites out there that provide some excellent resources. And the one thing that Susan and I really like about the way prompts are being written is they're so easy to replicate. So we can take a look. If you've not looked at some of these sites before, they have absolutely wonderful resources, all free. Newsela is an interesting way to build reading comprehension for multiple level types of classrooms, which many of us deal with, because their articles are usually written at least 4 to 5 different lexile levels. So I can be teaching a big idea in science, social studies, etc. And as Susan said before, I can have text-dependent questions that require different types of product. Procon.org, another website out there that provides different reading samples. And there again, you'll see some others that Susan and I have used in different workshops, but that we've gotten from fellow teachers. Everything from Teaching That Makes Sense, which is a site by Steve Peha with lots of free resources and graphics, to the Aspen Institute, to, of course, the wonderful things that the National Council for Teachers of English and Reading Association have for us. As we look, though, at these types of materials, to me, one of the best things to look at is to go into those performance level descriptors from GED Testing Service so that you have a really good idea of what is going to be on the test. But as we look at the writing process, it's important for all of us to make sure that we know not only what effective writing looks like, but what type of writing is deemed effective at the high school level. And I think sometimes we kind of lose sight of what effective high school writing looks like. Quote, how many sentences there are, but more importantly, what types of skills are needed to have that effective writing. So Susan and I always say, you know, we really want to steer away from how many sentences, how many paragraphs, etc. But do students effectively answer the entire question at a level which would equate to effective writing at the high school level? So Susan, I think we have a number of sentences or a number of questions actually on the writing process. So
yes, we do. One thing I will say for the person who asked about more sample prompts or some different things from that, I'm not aware of any additional prompts at this point from the GED testing service. However, I will tell you that Appalachian State University, their Professional Development Center, has actually done quite a bit of work on putting together some primary sources and writing some prompts. I mean, they're GED-like prompts. They're not tested and normed and all that stuff like the GED test prompts are, but they are very similar in that they're asking students to do some of the same types of things. So that would be one area that you may want to look at, and I would just do a search for Appalachian State University and professional development for adult educators, and you should be able to find those. When it comes to, do you know how the computerized test grades the extended response? Yes, we do have an understanding of how that happens, and the main thing that you need to keep in mind from a standpoint of having an electronic scoring engine is that the computer can only do what it has been programmed to do based on input from human readers. The GED testing service, as they were starting this process, they did extensive testing and reviewing and grading and developing the characteristics, identifying the characteristics or traits of different levels of writing, all of which was done by human readers who in turn then had all that information loaded into the computer. So from there, the computer is not looking for, oh, I have to see this specific word, because we do have people who express that concern. What if my student didn't use the term conservation? The computer is, of course, a much finer instrument than that and is able to look at, you know, synonyms and those types of things. So you don't have to worry about that. But I always want to make sure that people understand that what the computer is looking for are traits. And we have a real understanding of what those traits are based on the rubric that was provided by the GED testing service. If we in the classroom use that rubric and all those resources as they were intended, then our students' writing will vastly improve. It's not going to be an overnight thing. It's not a quick fix, but it is something that if we are going to make sure that our students exiting with a high school credential have the skills they need, then this is something we need to do. So when we do the next webinar, we're going to take a really serious look at the rubrics. We're going to talk about different elements within those, and so hopefully that will provide you with a lot of different information. In terms of how many sentences students should write, students need to respond to what the question asks them to do. And that involves more than 10 or 20 sentences. It involves being able to dig in and really explain how that evidence and claim are connected and to do those types of things. And so there's not a specific number of sentences, nor is there a specific number of words that students have to aim for. The downside of having specific numbers for students is that then students start counting words. And that was something that Bonnie and I have seen over time, is that students spend more time worrying about the number of words or the number of sentences than they do on the quality of their writing. So let's look at quality as opposed to the quantity. that is actually there. And Bonnie, I believe you found a couple of resources in Spanish when we were at COAPE. Some people were talking about that.
There are. If you look at the sites that we have put up, a couple of those you can translate to Spanish, or the translations there. But the other thing just to realize is we do have some publishers who have now put their materials into Spanish as well. And of course, everything on the GED Testing Service website as far as the materials that students have are both in English and in Spanish. So that is very, very helpful. But there again, when you look at some of these resource libraries out on the websites, the reading materials that we've provided, you'll see that a couple of them, again, they are not GED Testing Service or they are not about that type of thing, but they will provide you resource materials. And I think that that's the whole thing. Getting materials can be as easy as finding an article of interest to students, such as those on Newsela and Procon, doing that close reading process that Susan and I were talking about earlier, and as that end result, that step 5, developing a prompt that mirrors the type of prompt that GED Testing Service uses. That will give your students practice with materials. Susan and I have often talked, the first thing we would not use when teaching extended response would be the daylight savings time article, but rather starting where the student is, starting with articles of interest, ideas of interest, and going from there. We've often talked that many of our students really like the sports venue. So starting with something as simple as, you know, here are 2 teams, here's a reading on both of them, which one will win the pennant, etc., based upon the evidence. Starting at that very base level, having them evaluate or analyze the evidence, and then coming up with one side or the other supported by evidence. Going from there to the more academic readings, by the time they get to those more academic readings, they've got it. They understand how the process works. And that really is what it's like, just teaching them the process and then taking them from things that are part of their daily life all the way up. In fact, we had one teacher who said, you know, it's so much about what I do in my daily life. I'm going to buy something, and that's what I've taught my students. That's where I start argumentative speaking and writing at. I'm purchasing something, which is the better buy. Very base level, ABE level. Building it up to some of the things that you saw, such as FDR's speech. But it is indeed a step-by-step process.
Bonnie, one thing I would point out in terms of Newsela, one of the nice things about the site, besides the fact that it provides all these different readings at different Lexile levels, is the fact that it has so many different categories.
That's
so
true.
You can go through and there's actually one on war and peace. There's one that deals with law and money. So there you end up with social studies based articles that you could use. There's also 2 categories for science and also health. That comes back to other things that could help with some of the big ideas in talking about science itself. And certainly not to be overlooked, there are 2 categories. One is arts and the other one is sports, which, again, we have to get started with students and get them engaged in the process. And maybe that's where you go first in order to look for some of the things that are there. Another location is the Annenberg Classroom, which has a wealth of information that you can use in primary sources, which is something that our students need to be able to read and understand. So keep those things in mind. One other thing that we have provided for you, and I'm hoping that we'll have some more questions coming our way, because if you haven't sent them in, then please let us know. But I do have one here. It says, unable to understand website name. It's news, as in listen to the news, N-E-W-S-E-L-A. And that particular one is, and I'll pull right back over here, it is in your book, your workbook itself, newsela.com. and hopefully that'll be helpful for you as well.
I am going to tell you, though, because I don't want anybody to get out there and say, oh, my goodness, what they told us was not true. With Newsela, you do need to register. It is free. But in order to get all of the materials, all the Lexile levels, the different sample questions, quizzes, etc., you do need to set up an account for that one. But again, I think you will find it well worth the minute that it takes to sign up a name and a password for it, because again, they're constantly adding new articles, and I really like the fact that I can teach a classroom at different levels the same big ideas.
One other thing that we have for you today is this particular paper from Beth Burke, which is a close look at close reading. And it's just a resource that you may find useful within your particular classroom to provide you with some additional information on close reading and scaffolding and templates and all of those different things that are included there. So take an opportunity to download that particular article and go through and do some close reading of it as you work through. But again, what we wanted to make sure people understand today is that reading is such an important part across the board in the GED test. It doesn't matter whether it's mathematics and you're trying to read a word problem, or that you're working with extended response and students are having to write out their response on those. It all comes back to, can our students really understand the material out there? Because when they leave our classrooms, we want them to have those skills that they can transfer on into the workplace and on into higher education. So in looking at the date and time of June's webinar, and Bonnie, I don't know if you have that one. Oh, it is
yes,
June?
It's the 23rd of June.
That's right. So, and it'll be same time, same place as right now. So we start at 4 o'clock Eastern Daylight Time.
And work your way back depending upon where you're at.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions? Susan, I'm sure people are saying, we thought this was going to be something on constructed response. Why in the world did we do so much on close reading? And we did so much on close reading because students can't get to that next step without it. And as we look at some of the writing samples that GED Testing Service has scored, it's evident that if students had done a close reading of the article and had gone through those steps first, then they would have had more raw material to use in their writing sample. And it would have been, again, just a summarization. So as we go into our next session in June, we will dig deeper into what do the writing samples look like and what is effective writing? How do we go beyond the zeros and into the ones and twos? So having said that, Susan, I don't see any more questions right now.
I don't see any questions either, but what I do see is that we have somehow the actual hosting has turned over to someone else, so I don't have control anymore of any of the materials. So, Amber, could I ask if you could switch that back?
Sure, we're going to take a look right now.
Okay, thank you very much. Bonnie, I noticed that one of the things that we have here, a question just came in, and it is, I have a lot of 3rd through 6th grade level readers. Any ideas?
3rd, 3.0 to 6.0?
Uh-huh.
Well, one of the things, if you're looking at materials, Newsela will go down that low. But as far as close reading skills, as Susan said earlier, it really is about the level of complexity and the product you require. So I can go through those same 5 steps, even with my low-level readers. I'm going to get them text written within those levels. And like I said, I'm just going to use Newsela since that's one we talked about, although there are many other things out there for that level of reader. But as far as close reading, the same process works. And what we want them to be able to do is to hone those skills. But as a product, maybe I don't have them write a multi-paragraph. In fact, I'm going to tell you I would not. But maybe what we finish up with is a sentence or a couple sentences or a short paragraph that answers a more specific type of question. But even at that level, we should be doing text-dependent questions. They should be able to read something and answer according to the article, not according to their own opinion pieces. As you look at materials, even the resource that we had pulled up earlier has readings at that low a level. It also has writings at that low of a level. And I think the one thing that I've found when I start looking at writings for even that level, they are writing more complex text than I would have expected. And the other thing, again, you are at that point still doing some work with word recognition skills, but you should be really pushing into close reading and basic comprehension. Same thing goes even at that level with text structure, although I may not go into all of the text structures, but rather just start out with a couple of them. So Susan and I, if you've been with us before, and we really believe this, effective teaching is effective teaching, and an effective strategy should be able to follow our students from a very early level of reading all the way through. The same thing with a good writing strategy. What differs is the text we use and the product we require.
Okay, my students can read a word but do not know what it means. Their age ranges, of course, run the gamut like we see in adult education. The average grade level is 8.4. Any suggestions, Bonnie?
Okay, that's a fairly generic question. They read the word and don't know what it means. If there are a couple things. I guess when I'm thinking about when there are too many words they don't know, then I'm worried about the complexity of the text, that it may be too high of a level. But we also know that sometimes what students do is if there is one word they don't know, they perseverate on that one word. And that's the type of, or that's the time when we need to teach students how to read around the word and then see if they can infer the meaning. We all know that research strongly supports that the way not to teach words is definition, 10 words on Monday, test on Friday. But there are a couple strategies you can use. If I'm teaching something, can the students identify, first of all, in the reading passage, the words that they may not know? And then from the reading passage, can they infer the meaning of some of those words? And then what's left are the words that we really delve into using things like the Frayer model, where the word goes in the middle and they may define it in their own words, but then they also have to come up with other things that they own the word, such as once they define the word in their own words, can they put synonyms with it? Can they figure out antonyms for it? Can they use that word in a sentence? That's all about owning words. There are a number of word lists that Susan and I have used, and one is called the academic word list, and one is called the general service list. And as I said before, although I would hate to see somebody take these lists and say, okay, I'm going to go through those, and there's 20 words here and this is what I'm doing. What they do for you, the general service list, are those words which are of the most service to students. And most reading materials, except for technology types of words or words that are subject specific, are the words of reading. They're the words off the Dolch or the Fry list. They're words that, again, are common to reading. And as you look at that list, you may say, okay, Let's see what we can do with this. The academic word list, another type of word list, is the type of list that really are the words that we see that, as Susan and I would say, are more the GED level words, things like significant, etc. So those are a couple ideas of just getting you started with words. But there again, I would strongly look at when you're saying students don't understand the words, how many don't they understand? And if it's that prevalent, then they're not reading at a certain level. They are probably much lower than that.
Then we have one more question, which comes back to which of the listed sites include TDQs? And in terms of finding text-dependent questions, Musella is going to have some comprehension questions, not necessarily a lot of text-dependent questions, but they do have some that are included for different passages at different levels. Pro-Con, you create your own text-dependent questions. With Annenberg Classroom, there are a lot of resource materials that are included there. Among those materials, you will find some TDQs. But in many cases, and I think this one becomes it comes back to what we talk about our own pre-work, is the fact that any time we're going to be doing close reading with students, one thing we as instructors have to do is we have to be very familiar with the text that they're reading. And one of the best ways for us to do that is for us to create those questions. That way we can hone in exactly on the types of concepts or big ideas that are included within that passage so that we make sure they're covered. Someone else, questions created by someone else may focus on different ideas. So it's always, or at least from a standpoint, when Bonnie and I are working on materials, we go back and we develop our own TDQs. That way we can make sure that those materials are there.
And what Susan and I are both seeing as we're looking at those materials being developed now, we are seeing more questions being very text-dependent rather than independent. In more archaic materials, we saw many more, how do you feel, what do you think? But again, in those materials that are being newly developed, we are seeing that many more of the questions really do follow text-dependent guidelines.
And for those of you who may not have noticed or you're not following within the chat right now, we do have from Marty from the GED Testing Service the question on computer scoring. If you really want to know some in-depth information on the scoring of those responses, then you can go in and actually pull a reference page, and that is on the website, so that link is actually out there for you to see. And do you need to sign up for the extended response? And yes, there will be a time when the announcement comes out for that particular registration, and you will need to do that. And Amber, if I could ask you if there's a way that link from Marty could be going out to everyone?
Sure, we're going to send it out now.
Okay, thank you very much. What Amber from the GED Testing Service is doing is she's going to send out to you the link on the the computer scoring of the extended response. So you'll have that specific website that you can go to. Other questions, concerns?
Susan, this is Daphne. I just wanted to remind everybody there, if your students are using GED Ready, that you should definitely take the opportunity to score using the educator scoring tools to actually score their constructive response for GED Ready, because it will give you an opportunity to provide some constructive feedback that can actually improve their writing.
Absolutely. Thank you, Daphne. That is such a really good comment. As you're going through, you know, there are a ton of resources on the GED Testing Service website, and please have time to go through and really review a lot of the materials that are there. The scoring tools are fantastic tools, not just for being able to give the student a score, but for us to really be able to dive a little bit deeper into the rubric and understand, kind of do that analysis and evaluation thing Bonnie was talking about earlier to help students as they're moving through. We also have a question that just came in. What advice can you give to educators about assisting students in increasing their reading speed? Practice, practice, and practice. That is a huge issue, is the lack of reading speed that many of our students have. And there are some websites that are out there that have timed reading activities. One of them is Marshall Adult Education, and I'm sorry, I never can remember if it's .org or if what the ending is. But if you'll just do a search for timed readings on your any of your browsers, you can find a lot of different materials that are there that are helpful. Marshall Adult Education, they are located, Bonnie, is it Wisconsin or Minnesota? I can't remember which one now. But they have materials, especially for those that we were talking about earlier who are functioning at a little bit different level.
And if you heard Susan's phrase, timed reading, it really is a process, and it's one of the best we've ever found. If we want to make students read more effectively with better speed, and we're not talking speed reading, as Susan says, it's practice and practice and practice. But students being able to time their reading and to do reading exercises for timing their reading on a daily basis is an absolute necessity to get them to be more fluent readers. And so as Susan said, there are a number of materials out there that are commercial-based, but Marshall Adult Education at least gives you a free website. Their materials are written from a 0 to an 0.7 to an 8.0. They even talk about how you do timed readings, and that's what will make the difference.
And one other thing is we have the site for the TDQs. What I would recommend people to do is take a look at the paper that you received called A Closer Look at Close Reading, and you'll find some very good information in there about text-dependent questions. So that should be very helpful to you. Okay, one more that I see. I personally had trouble with copy and pasting on the extended response. Any ideas? Just a couple of things with that. The only thing the student can copy and paste on the extended response is within the text box itself. So the student cannot copy text from the source text and dump it into and paste it into the extended response, the text box. So the only time that students should be doing any copy pasting would be actually within their own writing that they have done, and it might be that the student wants to move a sentence somewhere within their own writing. So it's only within that box where they're actually typing in their response.
Oh, and Susan, Marshall Adult is in Minnesota.
Okay, I knew it was one or the other. I couldn't remember off of the top of my head. So, but Marshall Adult Education, they've used grant funds and developed materials, and then there are also timed reading activities from a number of different publishers. So, take an opportunity if you can to look at that. So, having said that, I'm going to ask: are there any comments, Daphne or Debbie? Either one. Marty?
This is Daphne. I just wanted to once again, say thank you to everyone who took the time to review the materials and to be on this call today. We appreciate what you do each and every day, and on behalf of GED Testing Service, we want to thank you for what you do. And we hope that you will take away some great ideas. Bonnie and Susan certainly, I think, gave us a feast of things to think about, and that's pretty much it.
Thank you, Daphne.
Thank you so much.
And this is Debbie, and I agree.
She is a woman of few words as we're going through. But sometimes. But thank you all to all of you who are, again, as Daphne said, took your time today to be with us. We appreciate it. We look forward to seeing all of you on June 23rd as we go through and talk about that extended response and dig a little bit deeper into it. So having said that, I'll pass it off to Bonnie for any last words of wisdom.
Just thank everybody for being here, and we'll see you in June.
Sounds great. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the afternoon or evening, wherever you might be.